Okay, let's unpack this. The historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, obviously, the New Testament is the main source everyone thinks of.
Right.
But it's really fascinating to step back and ask, what else is there? What independent historical evidence exists for this really pivotal individual?
Exactly. If you sort of put the canonical Christian writings to one side for a moment,
Yeah.
what can we actually know? What can we confidently say about Jesus just from those external sources?
And the answer, which we're going to dive into, is actually, well, it's surprisingly substantial, isn't it?
It really is. What's particularly compelling, I think, is the sheer variety and the volume of this non-Christian material. It corroborates key things about Jesus's life and, the early Christian movement.
Yeah, it's not just like fleeting mentions here and there.
No, not at all. We're talking about, considered observations from pretty serious Roman historians, documented interactions from government officials, even critical perspectives from other Jewish and Gentile writers at the time.
So it gives us this vital kind of independent framework.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
An independent framework for understanding the historical Jesus. So for this deep dive, we've pulled together a whole range of these ancient voices. You've got historians like Tacitus and Josephus.
Big names.
Absolutely. Then there's correspondence, like from Pliny the Younger, fragments from lost works, even some early Gnostic texts. Our goal here is really to guide you through these historical layers.
Sort of sift through them.
Yes, sift through them, carefully pulling out what they tell us about Jesus, totally separate from the New Testament stories.
Okay. And before we really jump into those specific sources, we probably should address something that, pops up sometimes, though it doesn't really hold much water in scholarly circles.
You mean the mythicist idea?
Exactly. The idea that Jesus just never existed at all.
Right. It gets some airtime in popular discussion, but among actual experts in the relevant fields, it's overwhelmingly rejected.
That's the key point, isn't it? The consensus among scholars, and this includes New Testament folks, ancient historians, specialists in early Christianity, many approaching it from a totally secular viewpoint.
Yeah, many agnostics or atheists among them.
The consensus is rock solid. Jesus was a real historical figure.
Absolutely. Prominent scholars, people like Bart Ehrman, Maurice Casey, both approaching this from a non-faith perspective. They've tackled these mythicist claims head-on in their work, extensively.
And what's the main criticism of the mythicist arguments? Is it just lack of evidence, or?
It's largely methodological weaknesses.
Yeah.
Scholars point to, poorly backed up arguments, a tendency to just dismiss inconvenient New Testament bits as later additions without solid textual reasons.
The principle of convenience, as Ehrman calls it.
Exactly that. It often feels like they start with the conclusion Jesus didn't exist and then try to, bend the evidence to fit, often misinterpreting things or ignoring significant counter-evidence.
Yeah, it doesn't really hold up under scrutiny when you look at the standards historians use.
Not really. As Ehrman, Casey, and frankly, the vast majority of academics, regardless of personal belief, have shown, the arguments just aren't convincing from a historical scholarship standpoint.
And what's fascinating, tying back to our main topic, is how these very non-Christian sources we're about to look at, they actually support the historical existence.
Precisely. These independent accounts, each with its own angle, its own agenda, they collectively point towards a real historical figure named Jesus in first century Palestine. So, okay, with that groundwork laid, let's get into the historians.
Right. First up, Cornelius Tacitus, a heavyweight Roman historian.
Definitely a heavyweight. First, early 2nd century. Long distinguished career under various emperors. His works, like the Annals and the Histories, are generally seen as pretty rigorous and insightful for their time.
And he gives us this really significant mention of Christ in the Annals, written, around 115, 120 AD?
That's right. He's talking about the huge fire in Rome under Nero and how Nero tried to pin the blame on this group called Christians.
So what are the key takeaways from Tacitus here? What does he tell us?
Okay, several crucial historical points. First, he flat out says the name Christians comes from Christus.
Right.
And he identifies this Christus as someone who suffered the extreme penalty execution under Pontius Pilate when Tiberius was emperor.
Wow. So that's independent Roman confirmation of the New Testament timeline for the crucifixion.
Exactly. Second, he mentions this mischievous superstition, Christianity, was sort of suppressed for a bit after Christ's death.
Okay.
But then it broke out again, not just in Judea, where it started, but significantly in Rome itself.
Spreading quickly, then.
Apparently so. And third, Tacitus gives this vivid pretty grim description of Nero's persecution. Torture, being covered in animal skins and torn by dogs, crucifixion, being burned alive.
Horrific.
Truly horrific. He even notes that public opinion started to shift towards pity for the Christians because Nero's cruelty was seen as excessive.
Which suggests they were a noticeable group in Rome by then, mid-1st century.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the big insight here is a top-tier Roman historian writing within, say, 80, 90 years of Jesus' death independently confirms his existence, his execution under Roman authority, Tiberius, and the rapid growth and persecution of his followers right in the heart of the empire.
Now, the inevitable question. Where did Tacitus get his information? Could he have used official Roman records? Maybe something from Pilate himself?
That's a really good question, and it's debated. Tacitus was a senator. He likely did have access to various official documents, archives, informants. So the idea he might have consulted Roman administrative records, maybe reports from Judea, it's certainly possible.
Would be huge if
It
true.
would be very significant. Even G.A. Wells, a scholar often associated with mythicist arguments, acknowledged that if Tacitus used genuine Roman records, that would be powerful evidence.
But what's the counter-argument? That he just heard it from Christians?
Some argue that, yeah. That he might have relied primarily on testimony or information circulating among Christians in Rome at the time. The crucial thing, though, is the debate itself. If he used Roman records, it strengthens the historical grounding.
Sure.
But even if he relied on Christian sources, it still shows how early and widespread the core story about Jesus was.
But wait, doesn't Tacitus include details, like you said, about Nero's specific reasons for blaming them, the specific tortures, stuff that isn't necessarily in the New Testament?
That's a key point, yes. Those unique details suggest he likely had access to more than just Christian accounts, whether that was official records, other independent witnesses, maybe a mix. We can't know for sure.
But it points away from him only talking to Christians.
It certainly leans that way. And that bit about the superstition being checked and then breaking out again, some scholars even see that as a subtle, maybe unintentional nod to the resurrection claim. You know, the thing that reignited the movement after the crucifixion.
Huh. An indirect testimony, perhaps. That's interesting. Now, our source material also mentioned a second possible reference in Tacitus from his histories, saved by a later writer, something about Titus and the temple.
Yes, preserved by Sulpicius Severus. This comes from Tacitus's lost histories. Apparently, Titus, the Roman general who destroyed Jerusalem,
Right, in 70 A.D.?
he believed that destroying the Jewish temple would basically wipe out both Judaism and Christianity, seeing the latter as an offshoot of the former.
Okay, so he saw them as linked.
Deeply linked. And the rationale attributed to Titus, according to Tacitus via Severus, was that the Jewish defeat and the temple's destruction were divine punishment for what the Jews did to Christ.
Wow. That's quite a perspective and not something you find in the New Testament explaining the fall of Jerusalem that way.
Not in that specific way, no. It gives us this fascinating glimpse into how Roman leadership might have understood the relationship between the two groups and interpreted history through their own imperial sort of divine favor lens.
So, putting both the Annals reference and this histories fragment together, what's the bottom line on Tacitus?
He's just an incredibly valuable secular source. Early 2nd century, confirms Jesus' existence, crucifixion under Pilate Tiberius, and the early presence and persecution of his followers in Rome. It's a crucial non-Christian anchor point.
Okay, next up, Flavius Josephus. 1st century Jewish historian, born not long after Jesus died, becomes a Roman citizen, works for the imperial court.
Right. And his major work, Antiquities of the Jews, gives us 2 direct mentions of Jesus. Let's maybe take the second one first, as it's less debated.
Okay.
When discussing events around the procurator Porcius Festus, Josephus mentions the illegal stoning of James, and he identifies this James as the brother of Jesus who was called Christ.
Simple statement, but powerful implications.
Absolutely. Just that phrase implies Jesus was recent, well known enough that his brother could be identified through him, and significantly that he was associated with the title Christ the Messiah.
So even if someone doubts the longer passage, this short one is pretty solid 1st century Jewish evidence for Jesus and the messianic claim around him.
Exactly. It's widely accepted by scholars.
Yeah.
But yes, the more famous and much more debated reference is the Testimonium Flavianum in Book 18 of Antiquities.
This is the one that describes Jesus in more detail, but sounds, well, maybe a bit too Christian for Josephus.
That's precisely the issue. The Testimonium calls Jesus a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, a doer of wonderful works, a teacher who attracted many Jews and Greeks, and states Point blank, he was the Christ.
Yeah, if it'd be lawful to call him a man and he was the Christ, definitely sound like later Christian additions.
They do. It also mentions Pilate crucifying him at the suggestion of Jewish leaders, but that his followers stayed loyal and reported he appeared to them alive again the third day, just as prophecies foretold. And it ends saying the tribe of Christians named after him still existed.
The language just feels off for Josephus in parts, which leads to the interpolation debate.
Right. And the dominant scholarly view is that Josephus originally wrote something about Jesus here, but later Christian scribes, tweaked it, added or changed phrases to make it sound more explicitly Christian.
But not that the whole thing is fake.
No, the majority don't think it's a complete fabrication. There's strong manuscript support across different traditions for a reference to Jesus in this spot. Plus, stylistically, much of it does fit Josephus's writing. And think about that second mention of James.
It would be weird to just drop brother of Jesus called Christ if he hadn't introduced Jesus earlier.
Exactly. It feels abrupt without the earlier, more detailed introduction. So the insight here is really about the complexity of textual transmission and needing to be critical about potential later changes while still recognizing the core historical data.
Our source material mentioned Joseph Klausner and an Arabic manuscript discovery. How do they fit in?
Okay, so Joseph Klausner, a major 20th century Jewish scholar, argued for partial authenticity. He thought Josephus definitely wrote about Jesus, but identified specific phrases like, if it be lawful to call him a man, and he was the Christ, as the most likely Christian additions.
Makes sense. And the Arabic version?
That was discovered by Shlomo Pines. It's a version of the Testimonium found in a 10th century Arabic manuscript by Agapius. It's shorter and, crucially, much less overtly theological.
How so?
It calls Jesus a wise man whose conduct was good. It mentions the accusations, Pilate's condemnation to crucifixion, and says his disciples reported he appeared to them 3 days later, adding, and this is key, that perhaps he was the Messiah.
Perhaps. That sounds much more like something a non-Christian historian might write.
Exactly. Many scholars feel this Arabic version might be closer to Josephus's original wording, lacking those very phrases that scream Christian interpolation. It shows how ongoing research and textual discoveries can refine our understanding. James Charlesworth, another major scholar, sees the original as having some interpolation and redaction, but firmly believes Josephus referred to Jesus, and the Arabic version is basically accurate.
Okay, so even if we adjust for likely changes, maybe based on that Arabic version, what core historical facts about Jesus can we still get from Josephus?
Quite a lot, actually. His existence, clearly. His reputation for wisdom and virtue, performing wonderful works or maybe surprising deeds. Being a teacher with a significant following, both Jews and Gentiles. His condemnation and crucifixion under Pilate, the continued loyalty of his disciples and their belief in his resurrection or reappearance, and the fact he was known as the Messiah by some, plus that undisputed reference to James, seals the deal on his historical reality.
That's a pretty decent list from a near-contemporary Jewish source, even with the textual questions.
It's incredibly valuable. And most scholars think Josephus likely had independent sources, Jewish or Roman, not just Christian ones, because his wording and emphasis differ slightly from the New Testament sometimes.
Right. Okay, moving on. Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, another Roman historian, access to imperial records.
Yep, writing around the same time as Tacitus, early 2nd century. He gives us two brief but still relevant mentions.
What are they?
First, in his life of Emperor Claudius, he says Claudius kicked the Jews out of Rome because they were constantly causing disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus.
Christus. Likely a misspelling of Christus.
That's the common view, yeah. Chrestus was a known name, but the context strongly suggests he means Christ. This implies that, wow, within maybe 20 years of Jesus' death, his followers were already causing enough stir within the Jewish community in Rome to get the emperor's attention.
That points to really early, widespread impact.
It does. And interestingly, this lines up with the book of Acts.
Acts 18, where Paul meets Aquila and Priscilla, who'd been expelled from Rome by Claudius.
Exactly. That convergence between an independent Roman source and a Christian source is pretty compelling. It strengthens the historical plausibility of that early spread to Rome.
Okay, and Suetonius' second mention.
It's in his Life of Nero. Echoing Tacitus, he notes that after the big fire, punishments were handed out to the Christians, a sect professing a new and mischievous religious belief.
So, again, confirms their presence, their distinct identity, and the negative views some Romans had by the mid-1st century.
Precisely. So while Suetonius is brief, not as detailed as Tacitus or Josephus, He adds these little corroborating pieces about the early impact of Jesus' followers in Rome.
Every bit helps build the picture. Okay, now for someone potentially very early, Thales, a historian whose work is lost but mentioned by later writers, possibly mid-first century.
Yeah, this one's intriguing because of the potential date. We know him mainly through Julius Africanus, writing in the early 3rd century.
And the key thing is about the darkness at the crucifixion.
Exactly. Africanus quotes Thales as trying to explain away the most fearful darkness during the crucifixion by calling it a solar eclipse.
A natural explanation.
Right. But then Africanus refutes Thales, pointing out quite correctly that a solar eclipse can't happen during a full moon, which is when Passover occurs.
Okay, so the insight isn't whether Thales was right about the eclipse, but that he even mentioned the darkness story.
Precisely. The fact that a non-Christian writer, possibly as early as the 50s AD, knew about the tradition of darkness accompanying Jesus' death and felt the need to offer a rational, non-supernatural explanation, that's significant.
Does Africanus explicitly say Thales linked the darkness to Jesus?
The context strongly implies it. Africanus brings up Thales specifically in the context of discussing the crucifixion darkness.
Yeah.
Robert Van Voorst, a key scholar on this, argues the evidence strongly favors Thales knowing about Jesus' crucifixion and trying to rationalize this associated event.
So it suggests the story, including supernatural-seeming elements, was circulating widely enough, early enough, to provoke explanations from outsiders.
Exactly. It points to the early historicity and impact of the crucifixion narrative, even the more unusual details. It shows it was already part of the conversation.
Fascinating. Okay, let's shift from historians to government officials. Pliny the Younger, Roman governor in Bithynia, early 2nd century.
Right, modern-day Turkey. His letter to Emperor Trajan, around 112 AD, is just a goldmine for understanding early Christianity from an official Roman perspective.
What was the situation he was dealing with?
He tells Trajan that Christianity had become so widespread in his province that pagan temples were being abandoned, sales of sacrificial animals were down. It was having a real social and economic impact.
Wow, so he needed guidance on how to handle these Christians.
Yes, and he details his methods. He'd interrogate accused Christians, demand they prove they weren't Christians by reciting a prayer to the Roman gods, offering incense and wine to Trajan's statue, and crucially, cursing Christ.
Something a real Christian wouldn't do.
Exactly. Those who refused, who persisted in their faith, he executed, citing their stubbornness. This shows the Roman concern and their methods of suppression.
But he also gives us details about their actual practices, right, from an outsider's view.
He does, and it's incredibly valuable. He reports they met regularly before dawn on a fixed day.
Probably Sunday.
Almost certainly Sunday. And they would sing hymns to Christ as to a god.
As to a god. That's early secular confirmation of the divinity attributed to Jesus.
It is. He also says they bound themselves by an oath, a sacramentum, not to commit crimes like fraud, theft, adultery, but to be honest. And they shared a common, harmless meal together later in the day.
Which sounds a lot like an early Eucharist or communal meal.
Very likely. So Pliny, this Roman governor, gives us independent confirmation of Sunday worship, hymns directed to Christ as divine, high ethical standards, and communal meals, all within about 80 years of the crucifixion. He also notes it crossed all social ranks and ages, calling it a contagious superstition.
What was Trajan's reply to him?
Trajan basically said, "You did the right thing, Pliny, but don't go actively hunting them down. If people are accused and convicted, punish them. But if they deny being Christian and prove it by worshiping Roman gods, let them go, regardless of past suspicion, and don't accept anonymous accusations."
So a policy of don't ask but punish if caught and they don't recant.
Pretty much. It shows the official Roman stance at that specific time. So neither Pliny nor Trajan talk about Jesus the person, but their letters are powerful evidence for the movement's existence, practices, impact, and the Roman response in the early 2nd century.
And later emperors like Hadrian also dealt with this.
Yes, we have records, preserved by Eusebius, of Emperor Hadrian responding to requests about how to handle accusations against Christians. He emphasized needing proper legal procedures and evidence, not just mob accusations. Again, it shows Christianity was a persistent issue for Roman administration.
Okay, let's switch gears again. Back to Jewish sources, but this time beyond Josephus, the Mishnah, and the Talmud. These are compilations of oral law and tradition, right?
Correct. And interpreting them regarding Jesus needs care. They were compiled later, often contain polemics, sometimes use code names, but certain early layers are generally accepted by scholars as referring to Jesus or his followers.
Like the 18 benedictions.
Yes, specifically the 12th benediction, the Birkat Hammanim. In its later form, it explicitly curses the Nazarenes, Nazrim, and the heretics, Minim. Min is often understood to include Jewish Christians. This specific curse is thought to have crystallized in the late 1st century AD.
So very early Jewish pushback against Jesus' followers within the synagogue context.
It certainly looks that way. There's also a later recorded statement from Rabbi Eliezer, late 1st century, possibly referring to Jesus when talking about someone seeking to make himself God. But the really significant Talmudic stuff is in the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin.
Sanhedrin 43a.
That's the key one. It draws on traditions from the Tannaitic period, roughly AD 7200. It talks about the hanging talui of Yeshu on the eve of Passover.
Yeshu, generally understood as Jesus, and hanging as a term for crucifixion.
Yes. Based on the Deuteronomy curse about a body hung on a tree, it was often used euphemistically for crucifixion. The passage says there was a herald who went out for 40 days beforehand, asking if anyone could testify in his favor, because he was going to be stoned for sorcery and for enticing Israel to apostasy.
Okay, so that differs from the Gospels, the 40-day announcement, the initial plan for stoning, the specific charges framed that way, but it does confirm an execution around Passover.
It confirms the timing, the execution itself, understood as crucifixion, and the involvement of Jewish authorities bringing charges related to religious deviation sorcery and leading people astray. It gives a Jewish legal perspective, albeit a hostile one.
And doesn't that same passage mention his disciples too?
It does. Right after mentioning Yeshu's execution, it talks about 5 disciples giving them strange, symbolic-sounding names who were also brought forward and sentenced to death.
So the Talmud acknowledges not just Jesus, but that he had followers who were also persecuted.
Exactly. Later Talmudic passages get more polemical, mentioning magic, mocking the virgin birth. There's this recurring Ben Pantera or Ben Pandera tradition linking Mary to a Roman soldier named Panthera.
Which connects to Celsus later, right?
It does, yeah. Celsus picks up that Panthera story too. So while the Talmud is clearly antagonistic and compiled later, these earlier layers, especially Sanhedrin 43a, provide independent Jewish confirmation of Jesus' execution around Passover on religious charges and the existence of his persecuted disciples.
A valuable, if hostile, piece of the puzzle. Okay, how about other Gentile sources? Lucian of Samosata, the 2nd century Greek satirist.
Ah, Lucian. He was sharp-tongued, critiqued everyone, and in his work on the philosopher Peregrinus Proteus, who apparently flirted with Christianity for a while,
Right.
Lucian mocks the Christians. But in doing so, he tells us quite a bit. He talks about them worshiping that distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was, importantly, crucified in Palestine.
So even in mockery, he confirms Jesus' existence, crucifixion, and role as founder.
Absolutely. And he hits on their core beliefs, too, again, while making fun of them. He mentions their belief in immortality, their intense brotherly love, they're all brothers, denying the Greek gods, worshiping this crucified sage, living by his laws, sharing property, and having this remarkable contempt for death.
It's amazing how much he confirms just by trying to satirize them.
It really is. He even calls Jesus a sage, comparing him to philosophers, though mockingly, and he notes they have sacred writings they follow. So Lucian, this critical outsider in the mid-2nd century, inadvertently gives us a great snapshot of Christian beliefs and practices.
Unintentional testimony. Now, what about Mara bar Serapion, a Syrian Stoic?
This is a letter, probably 1st century according to Van Vorst and others, though dating is debated, late 1st to 3rd. Mara is in prison, writing to his son, advising him to seek wisdom.
Okay.
And he draws parallels between wise men who were unjustly killed. Socrates, killed by the Athenians, Pythagoras burned, and a wise king killed by the Jews.
Wise king being Jesus.
The context points strongly that way. He asks, what advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? He argues that these figures didn't truly die because they lived on in the teaching which he had given. And he suggests divine judgment fell on those responsible.
So Mara sees Jesus as a wise, virtuous teacher, unjustly executed by Jewish authorities, whose teachings endured.
Exactly. It shows Jesus was recognized as a significant wisdom figure outside the Judeo-Christian sphere relatively early on. The king title is also interesting.
Yeah, maybe reflecting how his messianic claim was understood even by outsiders. Okay, let's venture into Gnostic sources. We need caution here, right? These are theologically driven.
Definitely caution. 2nd to 4th century mostly. Complex theological systems, mixing Christian and other ideas. Not straightforward historical reporting, but some early ones might reflect early traditions, even if filtered.
Like the Gospel of Thomas. Big debate on its dating.
Huge debate. Some argue it's very early, maybe even drawing on traditions as old as the Synoptics. Most place it's 2nd century. It's a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus. Some parallel the canonical Gospels, others are distinctly Gnostic.
More about secret knowledge.
Yeah, it often presents the living Jesus, the risen one, imparting wisdom. It mentions him asking about his identity, includes parables. But the focus isn't narrative history. It shows the diversity of early Jesus traditions.
What about the Gospel of Truth, also 2nd century?
Likely 2nd century, maybe connected to the Gnostic teacher Valentinus. This one does affirm Jesus as the Son of God, the Word who became flesh, experienced by the senses. It talks about him being nailed to a tree, crucified, and rising again in an eternal body.
So even within a Gnostic framework, it affirms the basic historical claims: incarnation, crucifixion, resurrection.
It does, yes. Interpreted through their lens, but the core events are acknowledged.
And briefly, the Apocryphon of John and the treatise on the resurrection.
Apocryphon of John is heavily mythological, about cosmology, creation. Not much on the historical Jesus' life, though it starts with a supposed historical scene. Treatise on the resurrection, late 2nd century, does affirm Jesus as Son of God and Son of Man, lived in flesh, conquered death, rose again, and insists it wasn't an illusion. It stresses the present reality of resurrection for believers. Again, theological, but acknowledges the historical reference points.
So the Gnostic texts, while complex, generally work from the assumption of a historical Jesus who died and was believed to have risen.
That seems to be the case, yes. They reinterpret the significance, but don't deny the foundational events.
Okay, what about works that are now lost, but referenced by others, like the Acts of Pontius Pilate?
Ah, yes. Justin Martyr and Tertullian, 2nd century Christians, mentioned this. They claim it was an official Roman report from Pilate to Tiberius that supposedly confirmed details of the crucifixion, pierced hands and feet, casting lots for clothes, and even miracles.
Sounds convenient. Did it actually exist?
Well, no copies survive. It's possible Pilate sent a report, standard procedure. But whether Justin and Tertullian actually saw it or knew its contents is highly questionable. Many scholars think they were likely referring to an apocryphal gospel that was circulating called the Acts of Pilate, trying to give it official weight. So we can't really rely on it as independent Roman evidence.
Okay. And Phlegon, freedman of Emperor Hadrian.
Right, early 2nd century, his work is also lost, known through Origen and Julius Africanus. They say Phlegon recorded some of Jesus' prophecies that came true. More significantly, he apparently mentioned a great eclipse. Africanus again specifies a solar eclipse at the full moon and earthquakes during Tiberius' reign, around the time Jesus was crucified.
Similar to Thales, then, recording unusual phenomena linked to the crucifixion time.
Exactly. There's also a vaguer possible reference later about Phlegon mentioning Jesus appearing after death with nail marks. Again, it shows non-Christians in the early 2nd century were aware of and discussing these events associated with Jesus' death.
What about the Gospel of Peter and Celsus? These are a bit later, mid to late 2nd century.
The Gospel of Peter, known from a fragment, has legendary stuff, a talking cross, the stone rolling away on its own. But it clearly knows the basic passion narrative. Trial, beating, crucifixion details, burial by Joseph, guards at the tomb, earthquake, torn veil. It shows how traditions developed, but its historical value for the original events is limited by its date and legendary elements.
And Celsus, the pagan philosopher attacking Christianity.
Celsus is fascinating because he's hostile, writing around 160-180 AD, but his attacks show how much he knew about Christian claims. He mentions the Panthera story about Mary's conception. He knows Jesus performed miracles and exorcisms, calls it magic, knows Jesus was poor, had disciples, predicted his resurrection, was crucified. He knows about the post-death appearances, dismissively mentioning a hysterical woman seeing him. He knows Christians worship Jesus as Son of Man.
So even in trying to debunk Christianity, Celsus confirms the core elements of the story were well established by the late 2nd century.
Precisely. His hostility makes his confirmation of the circulating narrative even more significant, in a way.
Lastly, archaeology. Anything direct? Or just context?
Mostly context. No, Jesus was here, inscriptions, unfortunately. But things like the Pater Noster, Lord's Prayer inscription found in Pompeii,
Sealed by Vesuvius in AD 79.
suggests very early Christian presence and knowledge of Jesus' teachings in Italy. The Johannine crucifixion, find the bones with the nails still in the heel, confirms Roman crucifixion methods described in the Gospels. The Shroud of Turin remains highly controversial, no consensus there. So archaeology helps paint the background, but doesn't offer direct proof of Jesus himself.
Okay, so we've gone through Roman historians, officials, Jewish sources, other Gentiles, Gnostics, lost works, archaeology. Let's try to synthesize. If we only use these non-Christian or non-canonical sources, what picture emerges?
It's actually quite impressive. We've got, close to 24 sources within about 150 years, even setting aside the more questionable ones. The core evidence is significant.
So what can we say about the life and person of Jesus from these?
Okay. Ministry in Palestine. Maybe born of a virgin, Celsus' hostile version. Had a brother James, Josephus. Was poor, Celsus. Considered wise, virtuous, ethical, Josephus Maro bar Serapion. Had many disciples, Josephus Talmud, maybe Gnostic texts, Celsus. Was worshipped as divine by followers, Pliny, Lucian. Believed to be the Messiah, Josephus. Son of man, Celsus. A king, Maro bar Serapion.
What about his teaching and actions?
Seen as a sage or philosopher, Lucian, Mara. Lucian lists key teachings: conversion, faith, brotherhood, abandoning other gods, worshiping him, belief in immortality. Pliny notes their ethical oaths. Gnostic Gospel of Truth mentions teaching about the Father, his death bringing life. Miracles, exorcisms, prophecies are mentioned, though often attributed to magic by critics. Josephus, Celsus, maybe Phlegon. Prediction of resurrection, Celsus. Allusions to a Last Supper, Celsus, maybe Pliny's meal. Teaching about his return, Celsus.
And the end of his life, the death.
Okay, trial mentioned, Gospel of Peter. Jewish leaders saw him as teaching apostasy, Talmud Mishnah. Talmud mentions the planned stoning, beaten, Gospel of Peter. Persecuted for teachings, Gospel of Truth, Lucian. Put to death, numerous sources confirm this. Specifically crucified under Pontius Pilate during Tiberius's reign. Tacitus, Josephus, Talmud, Lucian, Gospel of Truth, maybe Acts of Pilate, Phlegon. Occurred on Passover Eve, Talmud. Nailed to a cross, Gospel of Truth, Acts of Pilate. Gambling for garments, Acts of Pilate, Gospel of Peter. Placard mentioned, Gospel of Peter. Associated natural signs, darkness, Thallus, Phlegon, earthquakes, Phlegon, Gospel of Peter. Died, Gospel of Peter. Temple veil torn, Gospel of Peter. Seen as unjustly executed, Mara bar Serapion. Buried, Gospel of Peter. Roman guarded tomb, Gospel of Peter.
That's a lot of detail about the death from outside sources. What about the resurrection, the central Christian claim?
The evidence here is more indirect from these sources. Tacitus notes the movement breaking out again after his death. Josephus says disciples didn't abandon him and believed he appeared to them alive. Possible references to post-resurrection appearances, Phlegon, Celsus. Gnostic Gospels affirm it theologically, Thomas, Truth, Resurrection. Jewish tradition acknowledges the claim of an empty tomb, but explains it away. Stolen body mentioned by Justin Tertullian as a Jewish claim, later in Toledat Yeshu. So these sources confirm the belief in the resurrection was early, widespread, and central, and that the empty tomb was part of the discussion, even if disputed. They don't prove the resurrection itself happened, historically speaking.
Right. And what about the followers, the early Christians themselves?
Named after Christ, followed his teachings, Tacitus, Lucian, Celsus. Came from all social classes, Pliny. Believed in salvation through his death, immortality, strong community, shared resources, Lucian, Gospel of Truth. Had sacred writings, Lucian. Met early on a fixed day, sang hymns to Christ as God, took ethical oaths, had a common meal, Pliny. Had church structures, Pliny mentions deaconesses. Spread rapidly after Jesus' death, Josephus. Reached Rome early, Suetonius. Pompeii by 79. Faced early rationalizations of their claims, Thallus. Endured persecution under Jewish authorities, Talmud and Roman. Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny, Trajan, Hadrian. Faced specific accusations and legal procedures.
Okay, so summing up the conclusions based only on this external data.
The death of Jesus by crucifixion under Pilate during Tiberius's reign. That's about as historically certain as anything in antiquity gets, based purely on the convergence of multiple independent, sometimes hostile sources.
Solid ground there.
Very solid. The empty tomb. There's some suggestive evidence the hostile counterclaims, stolen body, implied the tomb was empty, otherwise the easiest reputation would be to produce the body. But it's not as watertight as the crucifixion evidence from these sources alone.
And the resurrection itself.
As a historical event, you can't establish it solely from these ancient extra-biblical sources. The evidence confirms the belief, the claim, and its transformative impact, but proving the event itself is beyond what these particular historical tools can do. Alternative explanations, like the stolen body, also have significant historical problems, mind you.
But overall, even with limitations, these non-Christian sources sketch a pretty clear outline of Jesus' life and the early church, right?
Absolutely. It's a broad outline, corroborated from multiple angles, insider and outsider. As Bart Ehrman concludes, the historical evidence for Jesus is significant. Compared to, say, sources for Buddha, the evidence for Jesus is much earlier and more varied. Ehrman's quote sums it up. Jesus did exist, whether we like it or not.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. What does it actually mean that people outside the movement, neutral observers, critics, officials, acknowledge these basic facts about Jesus' life, death, and impact?
That's a huge question. It certainly grounds the origins of Christianity firmly in history. It shows Jesus wasn't just some myth that developed over centuries. He was a real person who made a massive impact in his own time, an impact noted by contemporaries.
How does this external evidence sit alongside the New Testament? Does it challenge it, complement it?
Mostly it complements it, wouldn't you say? It confirms the basic historical framework, the time, the place, the key figures like Pilate, the crucifixion, the existence of followers who believed remarkable things. It doesn't confirm every miracle or theological claim, obviously, but it provides that external validation for the core narrative.
So what further questions does this kind of deep dive spark for you, for the listener? Where do you go from here?
Well, you might ask how these different perspectives, Roman, Jewish, Christian, shape our understanding. You might delve deeper into the specific texts themselves, like the different versions of Josephus, or consider why this particular figure had such an enduring impact, noted even by his detractors.
It really highlights the value of looking at history from multiple angles, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the fact that these ancient questions about who Jesus was, what he did, what it all meant, they still resonate today.
So while the ultimate interpretation, the theological significance, that might vary hugely, the historical footprint of Jesus, confirmed not just by believers but by outsiders too, that seems undeniable based on this evidence.
Undeniable. And we really hope this deep dive encourages you, the listener, to keep exploring these fascinating sources and the ongoing scholarly work around them. The historical reality of Jesus and his profound influence are, I think, clearly established, even when you step outside the foundational Christian text for a moment.